Welcome to the Interdisciplinary Collaborative Workshops Public Scholarship and Teaching Fall Series. My name is Melinda Lindquist, and I am an Associate Professor of History at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. I'm one of the ICW co-organizers along with Ron Amanzadi and Haider Tun, and I'm excited to welcome you to our fourth fall workshop, Environmental Justice, Pandemics, and Health Inequities. Before I introduce today's event and our distinguished panelists, I want to invite you to join us every other Friday at this time for a wide-ranging series of workshops. Our next event is Friday, October 30th, and it is a special workshop on applying to graduate school advice for navigating the process. And this workshop is really targeted towards undergraduates at any place in their degree program who are considering a graduate degree, and it will feature administrators, faculty, and students across our institutions. For our broader audience, we invite you to attend our final fall workshop on Friday, November 13th, Stories and Voices from Activists in Atlanta, Minneapolis, and Washington, DC, an Intergenerational Dialogue. Please find all of our fall lineup on our Google site. All of our workshops are recorded and are available for future viewing on our YouTube channel. Over the past several years, faculty members and students across our four institutions, the University of Minnesota, Howard University, Morehouse College, and Spelman College, have been working together to create spaces for our scholars and students and communities to be in conversation and work in solidarity. These workshops are an important space where we convene, speak across experience and expertise, cross-disciplinary, institutional, and regional boundaries, and learn together and with our larger audience. Today's workshop, Environmental Justice, Pandemics, and Health Inequities, invites you into this conversation with faculty, students, and activists at a critical moment in the nation's history. This is a moment where the COVID-19 pandemic has killed over 218 Americans and inflicted disproportionate devastation on communities of color. But the COVID-19 pandemic is only the most recent example of how environmental injustices and health inequities have devastated BIPOC communities. Rather, the current pandemic has largely amplified the effects of long-standing systemic health disparities, which are frequently linked to environmental injustices rooted in environmental racism. This, in conjunction with the extraordinary pressures placed on essential workers, who are also disproportionately of color, and the prevalence of intergenerational households in these same communities has translated into hospitalization rates among BIPOC communities that are 4 to 5 times greater than those experienced by whites. This workshop brings together scholars, students, and activists to explore these critical issues at both the local and national level. So welcome to today's workshop. We look forward to spending the next 90 minutes with you. On Zoom, the chat is open. We invite you to use that space to share your thoughts and suggestions. The Q&A is also open. We have reserved the last 30 minutes for questions and answers, questions from the audience and answers from our panelists, but you are welcome to share these questions through the Q&A box as they arise. You can also open up the live transcript if closed captioning will make this program more accessible and enjoyable. As always, we hope the bridges that we're building between scholars, students, and community leaders will strengthen the work that's happening across our cities and throughout the nation around racial justice. It is now my honor to introduce our panelists. I would like to begin by introducing Dr. Fatima Shafi. Dr. Shafi is chair of the Political Science Department at Spelman College, where she is also the director of the Environmental Studies program and co-chair of the Sustainable Spelman Committee. Dr. Shafi's research, publications, and teaching interests are in the areas of environmental policy, environmental justice, climate justice, environmental education, environmental determinants of health disparities, and international relations. She is also a member of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and has served as an environmental justice consultant for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC. For more than 2 decades, she has been a leader in advancing integration of sustainability into college, university, high school, and middle school curricula. Welcome, Professor Shafi. I am also excited to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Wrigley Field. Dr. Wrigley Field is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Minnesota and the 2019-2020 Fessler-Lampert Chair. She is a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health and Society Scholar. She was so between 2014 and 2016. And her recent work as a fellow at the University of Minnesota's Institute for Advanced Study examines racialized health disparities as part of the case for reparations. Her work brings formal demographic techniques to the sociology of inequality and sociologically informed concerns about the hidden dimensions of racial inequality to formal demography. Welcome, Professor Wrigley Field. I am also delighted to introduce Michelle Roberts, National Co-Coordinator for the Environmental Justice Health Alliance for Chemical Policy Reform and Director of Outreach for Coming Clean. The Environmental Justice Health Alliance is a national, multiracial, intergenerational grassroots coalition of over 30 groups in 13 states. For over 2 decades, Ms. Roberts has provided technical assistance and advocacy support to communities regarding the impacts of toxins on human health and the environment. She has written about the relationship between race, poverty, and chemical disasters, and about discount retailers and unsafe chemicals. Prior to her advocacy work, Ms. Roberts worked as an environmental scientist in the government, and she is also a spoken word artist who has created a community-based arts program designed to advance social justice. Welcome, Ms. Roberts. Finally, it is my pleasure to introduce Kayla Alexander. Ms. Alexander is a second-year student at the Howard University School of Law. She works as a law clerk, student attorney, and environmental fellow specializing in environmental justice. Her recent work has consisted of creating a national scorecard to grade states on their lead prevention protocols, proposing climate resiliency plans for small towns, and helping to draft model climate change legislation. Welcome, Ms. Alexander. For today's workshop, we have invited each of our 4 panelists to start us off by sharing a bit about their work and how they are wrestling with the impacts of environmental racism, health inequities, and pandemics in their work towards building more environmentally just communities. The panelists will present in the order that I introduce them, and then I will moderate the conversation that follows, as well as the conversation that follows in the forms of the questions that our audience generates for our panelists. And I would like to begin by inviting Dr. Shafi to start us off. I'd like to welcome you again, and I'd also like to thank you for being the inspiration for this panel. We look forward to your opening remarks. I wonder if there might be a technical problem. So I think there's a small technical problem, but that's going to be okay. Dr. Wrigley Field, would you start us off? And then when Dr. Shafi joins us again. Oh, she might have rejoined us.
Should I hang tight?
Yeah, let's get, Dr. Shafi, wonderful. I don't know if you heard, but I did say that I wanted to welcome you to start us off. And I did want to let our audience know that you really are the inspiration for this panel. It has been my delight to work with you and get to know you over the past several years. So please start us off.
Thank you for that generous introduction. And I'm sorry, my Wi-Fi just went. I think that they have brain, they know when to agitate you. I'm joking. And one correction, I served on the NEJAC for 2 consecutive term, which is the limit for serving on NEJAC, the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council. And I rolled off on in August 2018. So let's start for the audience. I would like to set us up with a little bit of a history and introduction to the environmental justice, and then I will move on, and I try to be as quick as I can. Sorry. Okay. Put it here. Slideshow. Sorry. Okay. Okay. Environmental justice. What we are trying to do to show the nexus between environmental racism and then the pandemic's toll on the disproportionate toll of pandemic. What is environmental justice? Is really it broadened the world environment to include not just about recreation, but where we work, where we play, where we study, and where we eat, and what we eat. And also it is coming together of 3 different movements, which is civil rights movement, environmental movement, and social and just and economic movement. Dr. Bullard has this definition for environmental justice, which is environmental racism refers to any policy, practices, or directive that differentiately affects or disadvantage, doesn't matter if it is intended or not intended, individuals or groups or community based on race or color. The modern environmental justice movement, a lot of people believe that it started in 1982 in Warren County, where they wanted to put a PCB landfill in a predominantly African-American community, even though it was really scientifically, the community was not fit because it violated the guideline of the distance between the PCB disposable site and the water table. And then later on, 2007, they had to come back and remediate this site. There are numerous data and studies that link, that really documents that there is a environmental racism. When it comes to toxic waste and race, the first study appeared, nationwide study appeared in 1987. And then there was a 2007 study 20 years later, which really showed that even when you adjust for income, race is the most accurate predictor of where these toxic waste end up. And this was really, the whole study was inspired by the Warren County in 1982, which Walter Fontroy, who was the delegate from DC, went to Washington and said, let's see if this is just coincident or there is more to it. And then US Accounting Office, which is the now changed the name, Government Accountability Office, which is the investigating arm of the US Congress, conducted a study in the region, Southeast region, and concluded that indeed 4 out of all 5 toxic waste, hazardous toxic waste dump are in African-American communities. So, and then that inspired the United Church of Christ study in 1987, where they expanded the study to the whole nation. And that to that day, that was the first nationwide study to see if there is a correlation between race and the placement of toxic waste. And indeed, this study confirmed that race was the best indicator. And as I said, that with better data in 2007, they even realized that it was even worse than what the original study showed. And then in terms of air pollution, we will see again other studies that are confirming. This is one of the studies that came out in 2016, showing that the top 5% that are polluters that are responsible for more than 90% of toxic emission tend to cluster in low income and minority. So they called it double disproportionality. And then there has always been this, debate whether indeed there is that community came or after the facilities were there, or the vice versa, chicken and egg story. And then Dr. Mohai from University of Michigan put that into rest to show that indeed the communities were there before the facility moved in. And then in terms of protection, in 1992, the National Law Journal showed that even existing laws are not enforced across the board. The communities of color, the enforcement in those communities tend to be not as stringent as the other community. And thus, the EJ community coined the word unequal protection. And then subsequently, you can see that problem still exists when Dr. Wright and Dr. Bullard did their study of the wrong complexion for protection. They found out that when they looked at the 80 years of disaster response, they found that actually the government response is slower and to the disaster in communities of color. What we realize is that place matters, zip code matters. And then when you look at that, I mean, zip code should not be the DNA. Zip code should be an address, as former Secretary of HUD said, Deputy Secretary, that it shouldn't be really about zip code. So when I did work on health disparity in 2009, and I divided the environment into health promoting environment, health inhibiting environment. And it seems like communities of colors are clustered with all these facilities that transform their community into the health inhibiting environment. And then we see when COVID comes, like any other crisis, the face of it is the brown indigenous. And we see it where it is ravaging, whether it's aging population, nursing home, or prison population, or people who already their health are compromised. And then I know that that's an easy escape to talk about pre-existing condition, but we really need to move on, because when we talk about pre-existing condition, we are like trying to shield that we can't do anything for these people. But remember that we are putting these people, many of these people in the front line. So they get we call them essential worker, but we treat them like disposable workers. So we don't, and then you have, so what I see with COVID is that convergence of all these silos that have long been treated as silos. I was giving a talk last night. I said, I really don't like the term connecting the dots. I like this, the stitches, sewing the stitches together, because it's more permanent than just, connecting the dot. We look at asthma. I mean, the whole nation was so alarmed by George Floyd's "I Can't Breathe." But if you look at the history of asthma, the disproportionate toll on African-American women, on African-American children, in terms of exposure and in terms of morbidity and mortality, you see that asthma really brings the issue to the forefront. Look at this study that was done years ago in 2002 that showed that coal power plant, which is the dirtiest, air pollution, is really in the, mostly located in the communities of color. This is a report called Air of Injustice. And again, when you look at all these false narratives, when we talk about solution, we dichotomize jobs versus health, environment versus economic. We really need to reimagine, because these centuries of policies, practices that willfully blind policies and practices that has caused what is unfolding before our eyes in the pandemic. We need to look at those. And in the midst of this, another slap in the face of the community is that we see that the New York Times cited 100 environmental law that has been rolled back in the last few years under this administration. And then industry was given a carte blanche to go ahead and pollute, knowing that air pollution brings, extra threat to the community. As we saw, the Harvard study that was very narrow, focusing on only particulate matter 2.5, showed that the mortality goes high when people are exposed to that. And we know many of the communities are exposed to way more than particulate matter 2.5. And then these are the study that shows that really the regulatory mechanism is going out of hand in terms of rolling back, stopping, and gutting the powerful provision. One of the celebrated environmental law was National Policy Act that was actually enacted under a Republican president. That it's gutted now. It's gutted because the part that talks about cumulative impact and indirect impact is really loosened. So the federal government doesn't need to look for those. And then also we see that the rush is to make sure that even if the election result is different, that they would not have time to overturn these provisions that have been changed. And then the last assault has been the executive order that was issued September 4th that really using our tax dollar and deny that this country has any diverse population, because it banned federal government from any kind of diversity training, diversity talk about privileges. Instead, so any contractor, there has to be a provision in every contractor that they shouldn't talk about that. And I'm gonna stop here, sorry.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Shafi. Dr. Wrigley Field.
You're on mute.
Thanks, I'm just getting the slides up. Here we go. Thanks, everyone. So I want to start by talking about COVID-19 because the context of this discussion is that we're living through a pandemic that is already creating a historic worsening of what was long before the pandemic, a vastly unequal society. And nowhere is that as true as in the basic matter of who lives and who dies. So I live in Minnesota, where the dominant narrative is that we are an island of sanity surrounded by states whose overall cases and deaths are far worse than ours in the pandemic. And on the surface, Minnesota is also a more equal state than our neighbors and most other US states when it comes to COVID. So for example, 80% of the Minnesota population is white, and 80% of the COVID deaths in Minnesota have been among white people. So that sounds very equal. So I want to show you in a little bit more detail what COVID deaths look like in Minnesota so far. What I'm going to show you is based on death certificate data and that my collaborators and I have been working with. and you're actually the first audience to see these results. So what I first want to show is this chart is just confirmed COVID-19 deaths relative to the population in the state by racial and ethnic group. Those are the separate bars, and also time period. Those are the colors in 2020. And so it looks, relatively equal. Now I want to adjust those rates by age. And we do that because all of mortality, but especially COVID mortality, is much, much higher if you're older. And so if you don't adjust for age, then a mortality comparison is mostly just telling you which population is older than another. And in fact, what we're seeing here is that in Minnesota, the white population is much, much older than every population of color. That's true throughout the United States, but it's even truer here. It reflects, for example, that the Black population in Minnesota is an immigrant population to a much greater extent than is true in most states. And so here in Minnesota, we had this spring wave of the pandemic that was really heavily concentrated in nursing homes, which means it was very heavily concentrated among older people. And that's what you see in this blue bar here, but you put that in context adjusting for age and you see just how much inequality there is. And now finally, I want to look beyond confirmed COVID deaths and just ask how many more people are dying this year compared to the same period of time in previous years, what we call excess deaths. And what you see here is that in Minnesota, in the white population, confirmed COVID deaths and excess deaths are actually very similar to each other. But for other populations, but especially Minnesota's Black and above all, its Native population, confirmed COVID deaths are really just the tip of the iceberg of what has happened in the pandemic. There's a huge well of death that is simply not reflected in our official statistics at all. And some of those may be COVID deaths that were never counted as such. Some of them may be deaths due to averted medical care or other pathways that are indirectly associated with the pandemic. But all of these are pandemic deaths in some real sense that are not really hitting the public consciousness. They're not in our official statistics at all. And so I wanted to begin there to underscore the disaster that's unfolding around us, how unequal it is, but also how much of that inequality is hidden from view. Because I now want to shift to use this pandemic mortality in a different way to talk about the inequality, not during a pandemic, but in normal times, and how much of that is hidden from view as well. So for me, this story begins a couple of years ago when my colleagues and I decided to look at the 1918 flu and the period of time that surrounded it. And everybody now knows about the 1918 flu because there's been so much discussion of it during this pandemic, right? So it produced a level of mortality that is almost literally off the charts. In this case, the colors are just different regions of the country, and that huge spike is the 1918 flu. But what we found out about it really changed the way that I thought about pandemics and mortality. And what we found was this: during that 1918 flu, white mortality that year was less than Black mortality was every single year as late as the 1930s. And similarly, the white population's life expectancy in 1918 plummets. That's this big drop here. But it was still higher than Black life expectancy had been every year leading up to that point. As best we can tell from the historical data that we have, and historical data are always, limited and partial, but as best we can tell, this was true not just in the country as a whole, but in every individual region of the country. And so in this graph, the dashed white line is white 1918 mortality, and the lines are individual cities with white on the left and non-white on the right, and you can just see how high the non-white rates are, that they're above that dashed line long before the flu. And this past May, I started wondering whether the same thing would be true in this pandemic. So racial inequality in mortality is still incredibly extreme. The best ever Black mortality rates and life expectancy in US history are similar to levels that the white US population experienced 20 to 30 years ago. So one way you can think about that is that the scale of racial inequality is as though the Black population in the US had been denied 2 or 3 decades of mortality and progress. And so this question I asked, which is very simple, is how does that gap compare with COVID mortality? How many excess deaths among whites in the COVID-19 pandemic would it take for white mortality to equal the best ever Black mortality? And the answer I found using some demographic models is that it would take at least 400,000 excess white deaths this year for white mortality to rise to the best ever Black levels. That's almost 4 times what has happened so far in the official COVID statistics. And it would take perhaps 1 million deaths for white life expectancy in 2020 to fall to the best level that Black life expectancy has ever been. And to me, these results pose a challenge for us, which is this: to stop the spread of COVID, we shut down the world. So we haven't addressed COVID in all the ways that I think we should in the United States. I think we've prioritized business profits over people's lives in all kinds of ways. But at the same time, it's actually remarkable what we have done. We've rethought assumptions about the most basic aspects of how our lives should be organized, how workplaces will work, what our family life is like, how the government works. And the question I want to leave us with is, what if we treated racism the way that we treat pandemics, with the same sense of urgency and purpose? Because what is striking about pandemics is that they're so intimately connected with social action. We change our lives to stop them. But when we talk about transformative proposals like reparations for slavery or defunding the police, ambitious desegregation plans, the typical response is that these proposals are unrealistic. And the challenge that these mortality results create for me is that we no longer let the limits of pragmatism dictate the limits of our ambitions. So when it comes to fighting racism, I argue that these results tell us that our imaginations can't be limited any longer by how accustomed the United States is to profound racial inequality. But we should ask ourselves, if these deaths were happening in a pandemic, what would seem reasonable to stop them? And how can we embrace that same scale of rethinking and transformation when it comes to challenging racism? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wrigley Field. Ms. Roberts.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michelle Roberts. As you introduced me, I just want a slight adjustment. I'm the National Co-Coordinator of the Environmental Justice Health Alliance for Chemical Policy Reform. I'm not the Director of Outreach for Coming Clean. However, the Environmental Justice Health Alliance for Chemical Policy Reform is a strategic, and this is very important, a strategic partner of the Coming Clean Network. Environmental Justice Alliance for Chemical Policy Reform consists of environmental justice communities, specifically mostly legacy communities. And when we say legacy, it's a far reach. And we're so grateful to be part of this discussion today, especially with all of you wonderful students and academics, because for us, when we think about legacy, it extends beyond that of legacy pollution, but the legacy of the challenges of our lives. So as you heard, I don't want to repeat the other outstanding presenters, but you heard from them, especially our beloved Dr. Shafi, who is a cherished member of the Environmental Justice Health Alliance for Chemical Policy Reform, because in EJHA, as we call ourselves, it is not just our fence line folks, but equally environmental justice advocates who are able to help us serve our communities in a deeper way. Dr. Wrigley Field, I don't know if you are familiar with the Center for Earth, Energy, and Democracy, and you're shaking your head no, and so therefore I'm going to say to you, your assignment is to reach to them as soon as you get off of this, because they are a powerful force right there in the great state of Minnesota, Minneapolis to be exact, our dear beloved Dr. Cecilia Martinez is an incredible force to deal on. In fact, what I'd like to lift up to you all, that you invite her into this space. She is indeed a powerful force on that of energy. Okay. And so all that being said, I just want to add a little bit. I do not have slides, but I want to add a little bit of my, if you put, allow me to add a little of my story and bring our community stories. And then what I will do for all of you is share with you in the chat links that you can go to for our demographic analysis data, and all the bodies of works that I am actually referring to. Because I would encourage you all to read and digest and go through those, because we are looking at moving forward, not going back, right? We have a great deal of data. I'm looking at your awesome bookshelf. I want one of those behind you. And so I say all that to say, look at that bookshelf of yours. We have a whole lot of background data. I'm going to repeat that. We have a lot of background data. So for all of our fabulous academics, we don't need you to go back. We need you to take a trip with us forward into redemption and remedy, right? And so with that being said, 1952, the year that I'm originally from Wilmington, Delaware, 1952 was a significant year, interestingly enough, in my family's life, my mother and my father. My mother and father happened to be in high school during that time. They weren't an item. My father was trying to pursue her and my mother looked the other way. But the funny part about it is there's something that did connect them before they even connected, and that is environmental racism. What do I mean by that? My father's family migrated from Terre Haute, Indiana to Wilmington, Delaware. My grandfather was to take a job with the DuPont company. They moved him to be a janitor in the DuPont company. My father's family lived in an integrated neighborhood in Terre Haute, Indiana, in a white neighborhood, because his family is complicated. We're still figuring out the racial components of my father's family. This is important when we think about legacy. My great-grandfather, I just recently learned, he was the one that went in and got the house while my grandmother stayed outside, okay? And my father grew up in a white neighborhood of Terre Haute, Indiana. He was not subjected to segregation until he came to Wilmington, Delaware. He comes to Wilmington, Delaware. They move into a public housing. It was a brand new built public housing facility where they moved. His oldest brother then succumbs to one of our earlier, then they called it an epidemic, tuberculosis, right? So we had the flu, the Spanish flu, the flu of the 1918, then we get to TB. And TB is in the height of segregation. So this is 1952. My grandmother, equally my mother's mother, had cancer, but in addition to that, had tuberculosis. In order for my grandmother to be treated in a hospital, my grandmother was a domestic worker. Her white missus, who she worked for, had to plead with the hospital, that was a public hospital, for her to be admitted in the hospital on the throes of her illness. She was subjected to the 5th floor of the public hospital. That was the only floor they allowed for coloreds to be. This is during the tuberculosis situation. They didn't leave her there long, because then they moved her to a separate but unequal shack to die. Meanwhile, my uncle, and leaving a daughter of 16 years old without a mother. Meanwhile, my uncle, who was 18 years old by this point, was in a car with his father driving back to Delaware, because my grandparents in Indiana said, we're not going to subject him to, my great-grandparents, he will not be subjected to a shack to die, bring him back here, and we will nurse him to his death. So my grandfather drives him back. I want to fast forward into, again, being grounded into Delaware, 1954. My parents now are in high school, and about to graduate high school, 1954. They were attending the only Black high school in the state, Howard High School. So if you were from Southern Delaware, if you were Black, you had to attend Howard High School. It was located in an environmental justice community. This is what we call legacy, right? This is what we call legacy. You have Brown v. Board because Delaware was a plaintiff state. You have health inequities. You have a state that's its political economy is based on chemicals. Began with gunpowder, went to slavery, then to chemicals, and now banking in the great state of Delaware. But that's not the only story. We have communities like the community of Mossville, you heard Dr. Shafi speak to, that is where these communities came out of the bowels of slavery and actually are in unincorporated areas, Mossville being the richest in biodiversity of all of Louisiana, right? And then we come into the Industrial Revolution. Big business grows, but we also know in the Industrial Revolution, equally Jim Crow. So how were we going to be the ones for the jobs? So therefore, the jobs were like my grandfather, the janitor, in some of the most egregious conditions. Fast forward us into today, where we look at the works that we have authored, Who's in Danger, Race, Poverty, and Chemical Disasters. We conducted a demographic analysis on the heels of the West Texas fertilizer plant explosion. I don't know if you recall when the fertilizer plant when there was an explosion. What many did fail to realize is that fertilizer plant, people didn't even know what it was. The plant. They had no idea what was inside. In addition to that, we were very grateful that the thing exploded at night, because also what people didn't realize, let's think back to what Dr. Shafi talked about, the definition of environmental justice. There were 3 schools in elementary schools within a 1-mile radius of this facility. And so therefore, we were told people were thankful that it didn't explode during the day. This is why, where we really went hard in our Who's in Danger, Waste, Poverty, and Chemical Disasters. And we learned in our demographic data and analysis that there were roughly 134 million people across the nation that are at risk of chemical disasters, explosions, what have you. So we venture to say that environmental racism in and of itself is a pandemic. When you allow for people to live in conditions like this, knowing we've never addressed the sins of the past, knowing the conundrums of those sins, now we're in a space where you're telling folks to just wash your hands and you'll be okay. We don't think about the fact that there are people who may not even have access to water, let alone the water being contaminated, and the housing conditions, right? And now we're in an administration where the modest gains, because let's go back a minute, the work that we did with the chemical disaster work, we actually were able to sue the Obama administration over that, on that work, and that was the impetus for creating the Chemical Facility Safety and Storage Executive Order, which since that point is one of the pieces, one of the 100 that Dr. Shafi spoke to that has been gutted, rolled back, or whatever. We did that piece because of the fact that of the failure of the Toxic Substance Control Act policy to really fundamentally address and deal with legacy pollution and chemicals, it took a sideline note to, in a political space, to move over to address a market base, and we'll shop our way through so we could be sustainable and buy method soap and everything else at Target or wherever the case may be. No disrespect to our Minnesota folks, the family. But in addition to that, we don't talk about the legacy chemical lifeline, right? That is impacting our communities. And then we go into a climate conversation. We totally disconnect, disaggregate, don't even include a chemicals conversation. And then we narrow it to just a carbon-centric approach, thereby leaving all of the other emissions to, fend for themselves, and we'll shop our way through that too by creating market-based responses to discuss how it is we're going to reduce carbon and provide you with clean energy. Oh, by the way, what we didn't talk about was in creating that clean energy, we are now placing processes such as like the largest ever ethylene oxide cracker in the community of Mossville that created a not so voluntary buyout, and community members stayed. Reason why they stayed and did not take the buyout was because of the fact that they were not going to be given granted ongoing health deliverable systems, although this awesome project, as they announced from South Africa, no doubt, the industry named SASOL, S-A-S-O-L. Now let's think about the political dynamics of South Africa coming to the deep south of Jim Crow's grandson now, right? Now we got Jim Crow's grandchild running the show. And so these folks don't get protection. They don't get ongoing health systems, but it's going to bring $90 billion, 90 with a B, into Louisiana. We don't make these connections to what we're calling our clean energy. How clean is clean when you're leaving this behind? So all to say, we, the Environmental Justice Health Alliance, we're all about solutions. And I just want to quickly say, have engaged in conversations and processes that have led to that of the creation of local policies in communities such as Wilmington, Delaware, where the local city council has authored a cumulative impacts resolution, the first ever. We look at the state of New Jersey that just passed the first ever holistic environmental justice bill. We look at, we now have environmental justice policies federally on Capitol Hill through our chairman Grijalva and McEachin, and then on the Senate side through Senators Booker, Harris, and others. But all of these policies have been informed, created with the communities, our communities. And so all to say, we call for cumulative impacts. We call for full out emissions reductions. And then we equally call to and put to task our national groups, including national think tanks like the Center for American Progress, and pulled them to task and said the sins of the past need to be addressed. And we need to, if we're about a more just and perfect union, we need to work together to make sure the least of these are not left behind. And therefore was created the Equitable and Just Climate Process platform. And we then took that, and so our communities took that to task in this presidential climate election, where people even lifted that up. So when you look at like things such as the Biden-Harris plan, or you look at the Green, there's many pieces out here, Green New Deal, A Just Climate, all of these things are great because of the fact that these have been driven but especially this age-just climate that our communities were fully engaged and a part of, we actually helped to inform that process. And then very last, the House Select Committee on Climate, where we are really thankful to see and hear that finally we moved the House, where they actually dedicated that report to George Floyd, also lifted the fact that systemic racism needs to be at front and center in the climate, any climate policy and plan. And then we went one step further, and for although we did as best we can, we're still pushing at that. But when you look at the CARES and HERO Act, we equally, because of all these processes, have been able to now advance that into those stimulus pieces, although we need more. I'm going to leave it here. When we hear Vice President Biden speak to this in his plan about bringing 40%, this is where I'm going to leave off where I started. He's talking about in his plan, bringing 40% back into communities. We've always known, like, there's always been market pieces that's come back to the community, but this 40% piece is huge for us. It's not fully been defined, and this is where we need structures and folks like yourselves, we're so happy to be here with, to talk about how do we make sure that processes like that, which are very good for our communities, benefit our communities, and make sure that that the folks in our community remain and are not displaced. And like I said, we have a whole lot of volume of background materials that we all have. What we need now is how we move forward, because just the hard stop here last, even in our energy. This is why I asked you to speak with and bring on Center for Earth, Energy, and Democracy. We talk about all this energy policy and the clean energy. What people fail to realize, and this is what we learned through the Center for Earth, Energy, and Democracy, there is no energy standard that actually includes equity and justice. So how are we talking about clean energy for the savior of the day? Now, don't get me wrong, we're not trying to get up into an unnecessary fight. What we need right now, we, the Environmental Justice Health Alliance for Chemical Policy Reform, the communities who are so grateful that you invited us here today, we need your brilliant young minds to work with us to make sure that those investments come into our communities, but our communities are driving that process with all of your brilliance, because they too, unbeknownst to you, they may not be doctor, but oh, by the way, they are. Thank you for having us be part of this process.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ms. Roberts. Ms. Alexander.
Sorry, I'm just pulling up my PowerPoint really quickly. All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to sit on this panel with you all, and there's so much to learn from you all. I'm very happy to be here. So I'm here today on behalf of the Howard Law School Environmental Justice Center, where I have been a fellow for the past 5 months. And our center was recently formed by Professor Carlton Waterhouse, who is an expert on environmental law, environmental justice, and reparations. So as you can tell from the name of our center, environmental justice is our focus. Environmental justice describes the global movement to challenge and change the disproportionate burden of pollution and the effects of climate change on people of color and low-income communities. And race is something that has a significant influence over everyday environmental decision-making throughout our society, even though that's often denied by businesses, the government, and political leaders. Historically, mainstream environmental groups have also contributed to this problem by being slow to prioritize environmental justice issues plaguing communities of color. Climate issues such as air pollution, water pollution, and waste disproportionately affect people of color and low-income communities across the country. And this can be seen in the delayed government response to communities of color during Hurricane Katrina. It can also be seen in who was and is still being greatly affected by the water pollution crisis in Flint, Michigan. And as Dr. Shafi mentioned earlier, the statistic, Black children are twice as likely as white children to have asthma and have increased rates of asthma attacks and death compared with their white counterparts also comes to mind. So race best predicts where polluting facilities are located in America, and this often leaves the most threatened communities with the least amount of environmental protection. So what is our purpose in the Environmental Justice Center? So at Howard Law, we are taught to be social engineers. And this term basically means that we take the knowledge that we learn and we gain, and we use it to influence policies and laws that will serve communities in need. So as fellows in the Environmental Justice Center, we collaborate with professors, nonprofit organizations, activists, and leading environmental organizations to creatively think of solutions to support and advocate for communities of color and low-income communities that suffer adverse environmental harm. And we focus on the principle of environmental equity. So this idea basically means that the distribution of pollution and environmental benefits should be proportionate across communities, and keeping in mind the fact that long-standing health and social inequities that have put many communities at risk for adverse environmental harms are still present and thriving today. So currently in our center, we're working on a few projects. We're working on a climate justice project that focuses on creating model legislation. We're working on a climate resilience project that focuses on considering the best practices on advancing equitable, durable, and holistic resilience planning. And we're working on a lead prevention program scorecard. In the remainder of my time, I'd like to talk with you all about the lead scorecard in particular, which is our project that is furthest along. And I'm lucky to be one of the team leads for this project, and I've been working on it since it was conceptualized this past summer. This project was created to protect vulnerable child populations from lead poisoning and identify the best legal practices to accomplish this goal. So as I'm sure most of you here know, lead can be found in all parts of our environment. It can be found in the air, in the soil, in the water, and even inside our homes in the paint. And the CDC says that a lead level of 5 micrograms per deciliter is used to indicate an unsafe level for children. And unfortunately, approximately 500,000 children in the US ages 1 to 5 have a blood lead level higher than this. The CDC also recognizes that every child is at risk, but that children living at or below the poverty line or those who live in older housing are at a greater risk. In fact, African American children remain up to 4 times more likely to have elevated blood lead levels than their white counterparts. This is especially important because elevated blood lead in children can cause things like ADHD, delayed learning, a lower IQ, developmental problems for themselves and also for their future children, and more. So our center is creating a national lead scorecard that will grade each state on how well they protect vulnerable child populations from lead poisoning. So our fellows are researching every state's legislation, their public policy, their programs, administrative rules and regulations in order to give each state a grade. And this grade will work to compare the state's policies to the rest of the states in terms of how well they're doing to protect children from lead poisoning. And we're grading the states based on their performance in 7 different categories. So first, we're looking at policy, which analyzes whether the state has enacted statutes to reduce lead exposure, primarily in commonly occupied spaces for children, such as their schools, daycares, and other public facilities. Next, we look at funding, which asks the question, of does the state receive federal funding from the Environmental Protection Agency or the Center for Disease Control and Prevention for lead prevention programs and testing? And does the state allocate a percentage of its yearly budget to testing and programs? Third, we look at reporting, which analyzes whether the state's laws require health practitioners to report lead screenings and whether any penalties exist for failure to properly report high blood lead levels in children. Next, we turn to prevention, and this section looks at whether or not a state has a primary prevention, which means the removal of lead hazards from the environment before a child is exposed. We also look at secondary prevention, which includes blood lead testing and follow-up programs as a safety net for children who may have already been exposed to lead. Next, we look at testing, which analyzes whether the state makes it mandatory for children to have blood lead level testing at certain ages or whether it is voluntary. Six, we look at services, which analyzes whether the state has any programs set up to help those who have elevated blood lead levels. And last but not least, we look at transparency, which analyzes whether the state provides updated publications and reports on their lead prevention policies and programs and whether they share these reports with the CDC and other agencies. So upon completion of our scorecard, we will be publishing it on our environmental justice website so that it can be used as an educational and advocacy tool for families, lawmakers, and public officials so that they can become better equipped to deal with lead prevention and treatment in vulnerable communities. Thank you so much for the time to speak with you all about our center and our lead scorecard project.
Thank you so much, Ms. Alexander. And thank all of you for these really powerful presentations. I want to signal to our audience that this is a great moment to start sharing your questions for the panelists with us. So you can do that through the chat. You can also do that through the Q&A box. I also want to give the four of you a chance to engage with each other a little bit more. But before I do that, and in some ways, Ms. Roberts, I think, sort of started this off by also giving us a sense of how far this movement has come and some of the incredible changes that we have seen because of the sort of depth of activism within communities to speak back to the state, to speak back to corporations about the environmental degradation that's going on in communities. And so I wanted to give each of you just a moment to share with each other, share with our audience what you see as some of the bright spots and some of the reasons for hope in the environmental justice movements and in the work that you're engaged with. These are, of course, deeply troubling times, but the environment is, and these movements are incredibly visible and increasingly a part of not just community conversations, but national conversations. So maybe Dr. Shafi, maybe you'd like to start us off and then give everyone a chance, give our audience a chance to share questions, and then also give the four of you a chance to be in conversation with each other as well.
Thank you, Melinda. This is a great panel. I am grateful for all the presentation. I learned so much, and I really liked also what our Shiro, Michelle Roberts said, that the history can tell us a lot about this, where we were and where we are, and why the struggle continues. So I'm going to do it with the tradition that Dr. King put, which is we talked about our nightmares. Let's now talk about our dreams, because there are no shortage of nightmares. So one of the good things about initiatives is that when you look at a good start, that Milwaukee County resolution that passed in May last year before the pandemic, they went on record and said racism is a public health crisis. So that is, I think that was a leap forward in terms of calling it for what it is, instead of like the executive order that I said, denying that we are a diverse population. And also, as Michelle said, the environmental justice for all is really giving us a lot of hope, because it is one of those legislation that it's like bottom up, that Chairman Grijalva reached out to the community organization for their input. It's not all that we want, but I think he and Representative McKitchen did a great job in the bill that they introduced called Environmental Justice for All, that was introduced February. And there were several EJ forum to get the community's input. And we just hosted they just hosted the HBCU forum recently. So that is very hopeful. And also another landmark event that Michelle talked about, it was that the release of environmental climate report, congressional climate report on June 30th. This is by itself is great. And then they devoted 12 pages. I know it's not much out of the 312 pages, pages, just devoting 12 pages to EJ. But I think that that's a big change, that they actually went on record and included EJ on the report. And also we can call this presidential election as climate change type of presidential, unprecedented, because we see that Biden, a major candidate, has a climate platform. And then in that, there are really a lot of hopeful proposals. One is that creation of a new division within the Department of Justice, the division that would deal with environment and climate justice. And that is really very hopeful. And in that, they would keep polluters accountable, because right now they can pollute without really any precaution. And then the other hopeful event is that in 1994, President Clinton issued the Executive Order 12898, directing all federal agencies to make sure that their activities and practices would not cause environmental racism, and environmental justice as a guide for them. But there was no metric. But the platform calls for metric to see if they are really meeting that requirement. Another thing is that, many don't know, but there was a very consequential decision that happened in 1998. I'm trying to exactly remember the name, but I know that it was Select Steel, and which was a recycling company in Michigan, Flint, and there was a violation of Title VI of civil rights that were brought before EPA, and then they created out of nowhere something that this Title VI violation is subjected to if the company, first of all, violated environmental law. And if they did, then we can go after Title VI, which they created this big, gap and scapegoat to allow a violator of Title VI to get off hook. And they were allowed to. So one of the promises is that they will revisit that decision that was so consequential in terms of environmental and Title VI enforcement that are critical to environmental justice. So I remain very hopeful. I'm not gonna keep, I can go on about some of the rays of hope that I am seeing. So hopefully we will see that materialize. With that, I'm going to stop. Sorry.
Did anyone else want to add anything? We do have a couple questions from the audience. So looking at the time, I think I want to just begin by asking this question. It's in the chat. And the question is, can the speakers address the curious tension between, on the one hand, not letting pragmatics block or limit our ability to imagine and thus move forward into radical social changes and reorganization, and on the other hand, people wanting to see real on the ground practical solutions that create change and move theory ideas into reality? It seems that we need both. Is there a place and a time for one versus the other? And I will throw that out to I will open it to the entire panel.
I could say something about that since I talked about the kind of limits to imagination. I guess to me, the kind of irony is that I think pragmatic approaches often actually don't work. So I'm here in Minneapolis where, you know, we have a very active and visible citywide debate about what to do about our police department. And one of the things that is really striking about having this happening in Minneapolis is that Minneapolis has enacted a lot of the reforms that were supposed to be best practice reforms, and yet we still have a police department that murders Black men in the street, and that is systematically violent. And so to me, when I think about what does it mean to not limit our imaginations to pragmatism, it doesn't mean that we don't do things that have immediate positive consequences some of the time. So like some of the debate that's happening around here around policing, there are proposals to immediately move money and power from police departments into other social services. Those would have an effect, I think, right away on improving lives, not just in a distant future. And similarly, kinds of experiments that people are starting that involve having neighborhood level alternatives to policing in specific situations. But I think it's more about the framework that we use. And so in the context of environmental justice, maybe that means that when we think about limiting pollution and the impunity with which corporations can pollute our environs, or the military can pollute our environs and so forth, that our starting assumption is not that whatever we do has to be consistent with corporate profitability and US military might in the world, but we say like, actually, we don't accept that starting assumption. We start from, we want to have a vision that we actually want, and then we figure out what are the steps along the way from there. So I guess that's my way out of that tension.
I want to say the good news is that we are in a process of that. You know, when the whole situation, and that's why I asked you if you knew Dr. Martinez, you know, the whole situation we were thinking about when George Floyd was murdered by the police in Minneapolis, and we had already been in the process in this equitable and just climate process. And I want to begin by saying this is an exceptionally important thing to say, especially for Kayla, is that we didn't have any funding for this when we started, right? And so we started this, Kayla, on a whim. It was like some of us who were like fed up with the whole cap and trade piece, and how the green groups were all like lamenting over us not being in the Paris Accord. And don't get me wrong, we were sorry about that. We were sad about that. But what they never would listen to us on and take from us, especially from Dr. Martinez, who is our fearless leader in this and energy policy. I mean, you know, we're grateful to have an environmental justice grounded PhD person in energy policy. originally from Taos, New Mexico, no doubt, right? And and Native Indigenous sister, right? And so we're challenging these folks on their models and all of these things. And they'd never had to, oh no, this is what the models are telling us. Well, now, and we just kept pushing. And we created this platform, I sent you all the link. And I asked you to take time to look at that platform. While it's not perfect and succinct, but it was created by EJ leaders who had a reach and spoke with, like, especially for EJHA, we reached to our base. And then we come back to the meeting and say, yeah, our base is with this, right? And so that's what's in that Equitable and Just Climate platform. That's actually where we pushed on in these presidential primaries and the elections. And I want to say, even down to the Equitable and Just Climate platform, we had a bipartisan first ever presidential forum on these issues held in South Carolina, no doubt, right? So the plan and the platform and the piece is moving. And then when that select climate committee, we went to meet with the House just really quickly on this with Chairwoman Castor and others, and they were beginning the report. What I want to be specific about is what's interesting. In fact, one of the folks who was with us in the Equitable and Just Climate process then moved over to staff she's in Chairwoman Castor's in that select committee process. And before we knew it, after meeting and briefing with them, with our EJ folks, something that's never really been done before, we were ahead of the game and was able to do something that EJ has never, at some points, hard to do. We stop the process like we can. We can stop a process, and that's why people don't like us, because we stop the process until it gets right. And we stop the process of that select committee on climate report. And now when that 588-page piece comes out, it's all peppered throughout with systemic racism, environmental racism. Now, yeah, it's going to take us a long stretch to get there, because we done already heard from some of the Republicans, what does this have to do with that? And then we even heard from some of the Dems. But at the end of the day, we're in it, right? And so now it's about the organizing and the will of the people. So we educate, organize, and mobilize to build power. And that's why we're thankful for people like you all to then help us go into the academics and push. Thank you, Kayla, for what you all are doing over there. And Howard, I'll leave it there with my good friend, Dr. Daria Neal. I don't know if you know Daria, well, I just promoted her to a doctor, but she's Attorney Neal, who's one of the professors over at Howard Law. Thank you for that great work that you all are doing over there in that process. I'll leave it here. We can, we're there, you all. We just need to unite and move it.
Thank you so much. I think just briefly, I will agree with you. And I'll say, I think that whenever you push for the radical social change, that's whenever you do start to see the real change on the ground. I don't think it's two separate ideas. I think it's you ask for something huge, the sky's the limit, and you get this much and you say, okay, this is the starting point and we're going to take it further, but now we're in the door. So just wanted to add that on.
And if I could just add on to that, we never thought we would hear our national friends, right, Dr. Shafi? We never thought we would hear them start espousing the need for cumulative systems change to a cumulative impacts and a systems change to addressing mandatory emissions reductions, right? So we're like, now they're held up in a space, and even inside of their own organizations, their staff are just, I don't want to go there, but their staff are revolting inside of those organizations and say, we need to be with the people on the street.
Thank you. Thank you guys so much for that response. We have another question which is a little bit more specific, and it's about the impact of COVID-19 on immigrant communities in the Twin Cities, but I think we can expand that even more broadly. And the audience member asked about the main environmental justice problems: inadequate housing, contaminated water. Sort of what do we see as those primary problems and their exponential sort of impacts on immigrant communities. And so the question is definitely directed towards Dr. Wrigley Field, but also I would like to open it up to all of you. And then also I do want to create a little bit of space, because we're having a conversation, but I also want to create a space where if you each also want to engage with each other even more directly, please do.
Well, I can say something about the COVID aspect. So I think a useful framework in general is that how likely you are to succumb to an infectious disease reflects your exposure and your resistance. So exposure is how likely am I to come into contact with this disease, and resistance is if I come into contact with it, how likely am I to become very sick or even to die. And the conditions of life for people of color and for immigrants in the United States both tend to systematically increase exposure and decrease resistance. But for a particular pandemic, one of those might be more important than the other. And one thing that strikes me is that a lot of the public discussion about racial disparities has mostly been about resistance. So it's discussion about comorbidities and things like that. But actually, it seems like, I think we're going to be sorting this out for a long time, but it seems like with a lot of the evidence that we have, a lot of the action is really in the exposure piece. And so like housing, like you talked about in the question, is definitely a piece of that. If you live in more crowded conditions, you live in multi-generational homes, that can be a risk factor. But to me, the piece that is really the standout piece with COVID is actually about workplace exposures. And I think it's been a weakness of public health that we have underplayed workplaces as a really key organizer of how long people live and what their lives are like. And the pandemic makes it really obvious what a mistake that is. And thinking about exposure to pollution also makes it really obvious. I think that was a mistake all along, long before the pandemic.
I also think that I agree with Professor Wrigley about it. And I think that if you look at the broader picture, especially now the othering of the immigrant community and labeling them as rapists, as thief, and I mean, it's, as I said at the beginning, we cannot treat these issues in silos anymore. We really need to stitch them together, because without that, we're not going to have solution. And if you look at the immigrant community, the way they are dehumanized in our conversation, that we don't even have empathy toward separating children from their parents. I mean, that is as basic as that. And then in the middle of a pandemic, leaving those children in ICE custody, and then knowing, even after judge rules, that they really should be moved out of that. A whistleblower saying that a Spanish woman are being subjected to hysterectomy. I mean, this is genocide. I know that we have a history of genocide, because when that started with sending a blanket laced with smallpox to indigenous population. But we don't need to continue that legacy. Let's write a new chapter. Let's rethink that we are all part of human race, because we have kept many segments of this population invisible, and they become visible when there is a pandemic or a crisis. Look at the face of Katrina. It was a Black woman on the cover of Economist. Look at the face of Flint. It was a black child on the cover of Time. Every crisis, we see a face of either black, brown, or indigenous. And the data that were just presented about the death toll, I mean, I think that even though we are in the 21st century, there was a town hall by Senator Booker that they talked about how many communities, indigenous communities, don't have access to water. This is United States. And we're still talking about people washing their hand, as our Shiro Michelle was talking about, with what water they are going to wash. I mean, we have all these, it's almost reminiscent of the Queen saying, if they don't have bread, let them eat cake, a type of solution. So we're asking people to do, they can't social distance if they are living in multi-generational home. They cannot social distance if they have to get on the crowded bus to get to work. They cannot social distance if they are working in meat packing facility. They cannot social distance if they get sick. They take Tylenol to cut the fever because they have to choose between paycheck, putting food on the table, or health. And I think that these kind of false narrative, this discourse, have really derailed us instead of reimagining what can we do. I mean, is it really the box, the only solution in the box is job versus environment? You know, we really need to move. Or like with the climate, can we ignore history? As Michelle said, there are studies showing that there is a link between higher temperature and history of redlining. I mean, that is documented in 108 cities. They showed that those cities that had the history of redlining have higher temperature. Why are we just talking about, ice, whatever, and, we need to move the debate from spotted owl, from, polar bear, to real people, real time. I'm going to stop. Sorry.
Just very quickly, I just want to say that is part of the excellent work that Dr. Martinez and the folks at SEED are doing there in Minnesota. They have been engaged pre-COVID and even more so post-COVID. They work with a lot of, especially immigrant communities, like the Hmong farmers, the Somalis and others, and they have been actually holding workshops and works together with respect to addressing that of infrastructure inequalities and other things and health and what have you under like a part of their like green zones and other work. If you look at, and I sent you the link to their website, you could see the bodies of works that they are engaged in with that. And then just equally quickly, I do know in one of the project we're working on with folks in Louisville, Kentucky right now, an outstanding community leader there by the name of Ebony Cochran, who we love. They appeal to the Air Pollution Control Board and on the heels of COVID, and ask them, what is your distance plan for coming back to, we're talking about labor, what is your distance plan inside the plants? And it was quite interesting to see the response from APCD. And then we went through their response line by line. I'm a former environmental scientist, and along with Ebony and a community member who works inside of local industries, we went through the response and then we tailored it with our response back to them. And I actually just received a text from Ebony today before I got on saying that they just recently heard back from them and they're going to be in discussion. So here's that piece where an EJ community moved the needle on the DEP, on their, regulatory body to even force them to, like you say, to make the move to protect the. And so I just wanted to lift that up as an example of of what communities can even do through the power they have.
I think something quick worth mentioning on the topic of immigrant communities during COVID-19 is that we know that if you have an underlying condition, you are more likely to have a deadly or a horrible case of COVID. And I actually have a statistic on hand that says African Americans and the Latinx community are exposed at 2.7 times the rate of whites to nitrogen dioxide, NO2, which is a cause of heart disease, asthma, and other lung diseases. So on top of having to go to work, having to take public transportation, not being able to properly social distance due to housing or being an essential worker, they also are more likely to have underlying conditions. Why do they have these underlying conditions? Because of the air pollution. Why is the air pollution affecting them? Because the factories and the waste sites are in their neighborhood. And why do they live there? Because it's the only place they can afford. So environmental justice is so important. It just goes so deep. And I just want everyone here to just remember that it's not coincidental. It is within the system. And this is why we need those radical ideas to break in new ideas.
Thank you so much. I think that's a wonderful place for us today to end our workshop. But I think what we also see in these workshops is that it's always about beginning and sustaining and building conversations across our institutions, between our cities, especially around our activist communities. So let me just end by saying thank you so much, Ms. Alexander. Thank you so much, Ms. Roberts. Thank you so much, Dr. Shafi. Thank you so much, Dr. Wrigley Field, for joining us today, for the incredible work that you were doing and that you will continue to do. It's been quite wonderful having all of you together, and also seeing the ways in which it seems like we're building stronger and stronger connections between our environmental justice communities so that we will be able to support each other as we work towards more environmentally just communities. So thank you all. Thank you to our audience. We will see, hopefully, some of you, especially our undergraduates, in the next 2 weeks for our next panel, and then 4 weeks from now, in our last panel for the fall, which is going to be intergenerational dialogues between activists in Atlanta, DC, and Minneapolis. Thank you all so much. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And well, everyone.
Great to meet everybody.
Are we going to stay like last time, the panelists?